This week I spoke with Robin Moira White about what the WPATH Files leak means for trans medicine. Patrons this week get access to Part 2 and a bonus interview with Andrew Doyle. You also find out what I think about the issue after a few weeks of interviewing, talking, and writing about it. Visit www.patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley.
I'm Robin Moira White. I'm a discrimination barrister practicing from Old Square Chambers in London.
Part of the impetus for this interview is that there was recently a leak called the sort of WPATH Files, a leak from an organization that has become provided the standards for care for gender dysphoria. And I wondered, what are your thoughts on that leak and some of the reaction to it?
Well, I think it comes in two parts. There was publicization of what I think practitioners thought were private conversations between medical practitioners considering treatment of trans people. And then an American journalist called Michael Schellenberger has written a report, which I have some considerable concerns about. It's a pretty partisan presentation. So let's take one example. And there's an American journalist called Erin Reed, who's done some work on this and outed all the errors and mispresentations in them. Here's a for example. So one of the things that people who are not supportive of trans people say is that there are a lot of detransitioners. And in fact, there aren't. The studies that we have show that the regret rates for people who've been through transition are very, very low. They're down in the single percentages. And that is sometimes said of itself to be suspicious. How can they be so low? Other procedures don't have such a low number. Well, in fact, it's obvious because people going through that process have thought about it long and hard. There's a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of thought goes into whether people transition. But of course, for some people, for a tiny number of people, it turns out to be wrong. I think that's between about 1% and 3%. But the Schellenberger report quotes a report where a couple of researchers asked themselves that question. And he quotes the researchers asking the question and saying, this looks like a very low level of transition. But what he doesn't then do is go on to quote the next 3 or 4 lines where the researchers ask themselves that question and come to the conclusion that, in fact, the statistics are reliable and should be relied on. So all the way through, what we have is confirmation bias and picking out bits that support position. Now, I'm not saying there aren't serious questions to be asked about. In fact, frankly, any medical treatment that people are exposed to. But the debate isn't held by partisan presentation.
You were recently on GB News, where I applaud you for going on there and really sort of like going into the, what do you call it, the lion's den. But after you appeared, they had a detransitioner come on.
Well, to that I would say WPATH. I'm sorry for swearing, but...
Well, I would just quickly apologise to anyone watching who was offended by the language. But Richie, I completely understand the strength of emotion here, so please do continue.
Well, to be honest, the way detransitioners are treated not only by the medical community, but the trans community is really disgusting. We are forgotten about. We're not even counted. In fact, if I was to go back to the gender clinic, which I am very reluctant to do so, I would be counted as another successful transition. My detransition is not counted.
That they don't sort of count follow-ups, or they only count people who follow up and not people who don't follow up. What would you respond to that?
Well, that's criticism that has been made of some early studies, but there are some clear later studies that do make complete follow-up of people who've been part of treatment. It's fine. It's absolutely right that studies should be exposed to criticism and, constructive criticism. But there are clearly later studies where that isn't shown to be true. If it was true, why do we only see a handful of detransitioners? A real handful against the thousands of trans people that there are now around the world.
Recently, the NHS has made a decision to stop prescribing puberty blockers to children. Do you think that that was a good step to take? Do you think more research needs to be done? What are your thoughts on that?
Not quite as binary as that. I mean, what they've said is that, and they're right, that the Tavistock clinic that got completely overwhelmed by the number of trans people didn't do its work properly in terms of running the follow-up studies, and that now there needs to be a process within the NHS of doing that study. So that what they've said is that, assuming we can design an ethical study on children, which is difficult to do, that children will continue to be prescribed when it's right for them and as part of that study. What there won't be is a routine default to puberty blockers. And equally, the tiny numbers, I think the stats have come out to say there were 83 people in the UK prescribed last year for the first time on the NHS. The people who are already on that pathway will continue on that pathway and potentially, I guess, provide a route for that.
That's interesting because I read in the New York Times that that there was tens of thousands of people being prescribed puberty blockers, but I suppose there's 300 million people in the United States, so the numbers are bound to be
I
larger.
can't speak for US figures, but some reputable sources have. I saw two reports, one that said it was under 100 and the other one that said it was 83 in the UK. That's not tens of thousands. So,
What do you think of the whole debate about sort of transing children? What do you think would be a kind of humane? Is there a humane resolution to this that could satisfy people who are worried about using drug treatments on children and people who, I guess the rationale is that if the earlier that you kind of begin transition, the more likely it is someone will pass, the more that you save somebody from going through puberty, that sort of thing. Is there any kind of middle ground? Does there need to be a middle ground? What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, I think there needs to be, I transitioned later in life and went through some very serious counselling stages to check that it was right for me, even though I paid privately, but I went through the counselling stages in just the same way as anyone else would under the care standard. And quite rightly so, because this is serious stuff. And I think it's important. Occasionally we hear horror stories of people being prescribed after very short periods of assessment, and I'm not sure that's right. But if someone can show the deep commitment that trans people need to achieve medical support, and they can show at whatever age they are that they have proper and full understanding of the implications, then we live in a society that grants people individual autonomy. We're not a totalitarian society, and subject to proper safeguards. For some people, and I've met trans young people who've been immensely helped by the blocker regime, followed by cross-sex hormones when they're ready, followed by later things when they become an adult. Now, absolutely right that we have to identify those people we do the very best to identify those people who are going to be helped by that, and to identify the people who are not going to be helped by that, and not put them on that pathway. But to say one size fits all, we pretty much know that's the wrong solution in every aspect of life.
That was one of the findings, I suppose, that was, at the end of the WPATH files, they put all of the files that they had. They said lightly redacted in terms of people's names. And one of the things that was in there was that there seemed to be a kind of growing suspicion. I'm not sure who was speaking. That was one of the difficulties with redacting names and that sort of thing. You couldn't really tell who was giving advice, but they were sort of saying even, any kind of assessment is a kind of unnecessary gatekeeping. And that one respondent kind of pulled up a study that was no, going through these assessments means that you're going to have inequality in care and there shouldn't be these assessments. So do you think there was kind of this move away from doing these kinds of assessments? And if so, was that a bad thing? Should we walk that back?
Well, not through not as part of any institution that I know, any reputable institution. I mean, once again, I'm hesitant about transferring my experience to that of young people. But I mean, I, as an older person, as I say, even though paying privately was taken carefully through the counselling and assessment steps before I was allowed to do anything more permanent. And that translated properly to, a situation where we're dealing with children and their parents, perhaps, is absolutely right. I'm completely supportive of a process like that. That will not mean that we will exclude anyone who's made a mistake. The nature of human beings are that we make mistakes and that we have autonomy. And a proportion of people will get it wrong. As long as that's a tiny proportion relative to the benefit to other people, then that's the way in which we run society. We allow, the example I used on GB News were knee operations and hip operations to older people. They have a 20 to 30% regret rate because some people end up less able to walk about than they were before. And that's a tragedy for them. But as long as they enter the process, what we don't turn around and say is, well, the 70 or 80% who are going to be really assisted by this process can't have it because of the effect on the 20%. And if we're in a circumstance where that's the difference between 97% and 3% or 99% and 1%, depending on how you come up with the numbers, then surely those principles apply even more firmly.
It's an interesting example because when we spoke before, I mentioned that I had a very serious knee injury and I've got muscle atrophy as a result. And it, about once every few years, I fall down a flight of stairs because my knee gives out. It's quite bad. It happened once when I was holding my baby. It was quite scary. And I was specifically advised against getting knee surgery, that it's not a good surgery and the outcomes aren't great. And so I don't know, perhaps it's that we have to be kind of real about, I teach I used to teach medical professionals, you have to go in there, kind of parachute in a sociologist and tell them about social context and all that sort of thing. That's what we tell doctors to do, right? To be real about side effects.
I used examples that I think are accessible to people, to the majority of people who might listen to your podcast. But a different example is cosmetic surgery, and people are permitted to do things to themselves with the assistance of a cosmetic surgeon. Many people might not think was very sensible, but that's bodily autonomy. And as long as people are properly consented, within bounds, that's, we permit that in a free society. We don't say, no, you can't.
I've often wondered if we should treat it more like that it is body modification. Buck Angel was talking about this, so he says, I am a female who lives as a male and has obviously, gone through a medical transition, that sort of thing. And he says, I have modified myself to look like a male.
Just because we've gone backwards, right? We have not progressed. We have regressed to this idea that you can only be a man or a woman and you have to look a certain way and you have to be now, if that makes you happy, you go right ahead, right? But, I've connected the same way you are, dude. I do live male, but I know that I'm a female. You know me, I spray it from the top of my mountaintops because I don't care what people think about me. And to be trans means you are connected to your biology, period. There's no other way to be trans. So I don't care what all those other people are doing out there. They're actually not trans if they're saying they're not really female, but they want to live as a male. They're not trans.
No. And what's upsetting me too is that we are also now in a point with this trans culture where, I was thinking about this in the shower earlier. All that's happening right now is we are rebranding words.
That's right. Great.
We're rebranding words. Totally. Because guess what? My clitoris is not a penis.
That's right.
It's not. So stop calling it a penis or a micro dick or a T-dick. It's not a dick. It's a clitoris.
And he claims that he comes into it in that sort of conscious way, as opposed to sort of gender confirming another kind of truth. Do you think it might be more helpful to look at things that way, as opposed to kind of gender affirming surgery?
Is it really any different? He has had surgery which allows him to fit into society in a way that he chooses. If we walked him through the supermarket and then asked people who they'd seen walk through the supermarket, the majority of them are going to say, well, I think exclusively are going to say they've seen a man walk through the supermarket. When I go to the supermarket, the surgeries I've had and the procedures I've had mean that, I'm read as a dumpy, lumpy, middle-aged female. And that allows me to fit into society in a way that I'm comfortable with. I don't spend time, analyzing what label I should put on me or how I should analyze myself to society. I mean, fine, there are biological realities that we all have to live with in one way or another. Why do they have to turn into labels that we have to use for ourselves?
I guess that's kind of the sticking point in the debate is, as a sociologist, I always just used to teach, like, there's a difference between sex and gender, right? Like, gender is the role, sex is like, your genitalia.
Hang on a moment. They're both words. So there's the famous Humpty Dumpty quote, isn't there? That when I use a word, I use it to mean exactly what I intend it to mean and no more or no less. And many people, if we were sat down defining sex and gender, sex is often taken to mean something more fundamental, something physiological, and gender is often taken to be something a bit more societal. But there are plenty of instances where those words are used interchangeably and with each other implication, as indeed a case in Scotland fairly recently said that they are on occasion interchangeable words. I was watching a film about the American jurist, the other evening, whose name I always forget when I give this example, who the first female member of the Supreme Court in America, who the film's called On the Basis of Sex, and of course that was part of her argument. And she typed out this thesis, and her secretary came to her, who'd been retyping the thesis for her, and had used the word sex all the way through, sex, 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 sex. And the secretary said, well, that's, sort of taken to mean the act of sex. Why not use the word gender? And so her great thesis uses the word gender when some people might think she meant sex.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history to when gender came to be more widely used. And part of it in common parlance is to avoid saying the word sex. Like when we have a gender reveal party, because a sex reveal party would be a little weird. So there's...
The short word has the implications of the sexual act, doesn't it? That's, it's very close to that, whereas gender doesn't. And so people tend to avoid the short word, I think.
So I had mentioned Buck Angel earlier, and I feel like, so I was kind of interested in that approach that he was taking, where he says, I am a female who's chosen to live as a man. And he mentioned he still considers himself a feminist, that he had been a butch lesbian and had sort of fought for women's rights, that sort of thing. But there's some sort of inconsistency in the argument that I can't wrap my head around.
No one outside the trans community, just the trans community is what I've experienced for bullying. It's so sad.
It is more than absurd. Like, I'm so glad that you're publicly saying that, because I think I want people to hear that. She's not getting bullied from the people that you think were bullying her. She's getting bullied from our own people. What?
People within the trans community that call themselves trans.
They're jealous of you. They're envious of you. They don't like when people pass so well. They hate it because it's an achievement that takes a lot of work and effort. They do the same with Blair because she passes so well and she makes a huge effort. They get so mad about it. Like, oh, that's the standard. No, it's your standard. Mm-hmm. You never told anybody else they had to look this way, ever. And they're not going to make the effort, then that's fine. But they're going to get misgendered. They're going to get all kinds of stuff that they're not prepared to take on. And the reason, well, I can tell you that I wanted to look this way.
So then I had arm reconstruction surgery where my arm is now, I like to show people.
Can we see it?
It is deformed for life.
Come over this way a little more. No, the camera. Yeah, there we go. A little bit more. Oh, gosh, Scott. Oh, so yeah, how is your hand? Can you? Oh gosh, Scott. I'm so sorry.
So it's painful, and then of course, synthetic hormones, what they don't tell you is that there's a high chance of hurting bones. So now I have a spontaneous fractured right hand. Nobody knows where it's coming from because I haven't taken testosterone in so long. So I don't know what to do. Do I get back on testosterone so my bones don't break?
My God.
Do I not do this? Do I not do that? Well, it's experimental. Who the fuck knows what to do?
That's
And
right.
that's
Thank
the
you for
kind of
saying
stuff
that.
you can't get out to people because people are not listening. They think it's about bigotry. This is not this life.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. You better understand how powerful this interview is and what this guy does, okay, to actually to sound the alarms. What's wrong with everybody?
So he argues that we should go back to transsexualism. And I interviewed Andrew Doyle, and he said the same thing. We need to go back to transsexualism. And by that, he seems to mean that we should understand that people are one sex and they wish to live as the other. And Buck says, if I can be on, use his first name, that if people don't make an effort to pass, then they should just expect that they will be misgendered, that's going to happen. But then this seems to contradict some of his reluctance or reticence around transmedicalism. So he interviewed someone recently, a female to male transgender person, or I guess that he would sort of identify as transsexual, I suppose. And they were talking about the horrors of this surgery. And they were saying this is not a good surgery, the sort of, female to male surgery, and that it causes all these issues and so on. But he's sort of saying like, well, you have to pass. So, the old sort of consensus in society was if you passed, you passed, right? That, if you saw somebody in the supermarket, you didn't know, right? But then you're kind of saying, well, then you have to go through you're forcing people to go through a medical transition.
It's like the argument about free speech. Free speech isn't worth anything if all we're going to do is protect vanilla free speech. So I say things which are not controversial, fine, I don't bump into a problem. So if you take a trans person who breezes through society and isn't read as a trans person, then, who notices? It only becomes, and there are people who are as committed to being trans, are trans, as much trans as other people who, through size and shape and age and goodness knows what, don't easily fit in. I mean, I am fortunate to have my own hair. I've moved some of it about so that it's in the places I would like it to be. But I was fortunate to be able to do that. There are people who transition, particularly there are male to female people who transition later in life, who have got to the point where they don't have enough of their own hair and therefore are stuck having, if they present in public, to wear a wig, for example. And wigs are not always easy to conceal or not always perfectly natural. And if you transition later in life, it can be more difficult. Now, those people are no less trans. They're, in my view, no less deserving of acceptance. And so this idea, who's to say who passes as well? Who's going to hold up the shade guard? I mean, if you've watched the GB News thing, I talked about voice in my case. And now I generally pass when people see me. But if they listen to me, they'll be thinking, well, that's more of a male voice than a female voice. Although I have to say the combination of seeing me and hearing me tends to disabuse them of that view. So, but if I'm, I don't know, in the stall in the ladies, I tend not to speak. I would tend not to take a mobile phone call in there because I recognize that could sound inappropriate to someone. So I take steps to pass as effectively as I can. And who's to judge whether that's acceptable? One of the things about passing is we know it doesn't work as a test, because when the bathroom bills were abroad in America, there are many more butch lesbians in society than there are trans women. And a rough calculation, I think there are 40 times as many butch lesbians in society as there are trans women. And guess who it was who were being turfed out of federal bathrooms in the US? It was butch trans women who were subject to question and criticism by if the janitor was actually going to enforce things. I mean, very few did. But when we got to that point, it wasn't the few trans women that there are, it was the butch lesbians who were in trouble.
And it didn't even make any sense, too, because like what the panic was supposed to be about was men dressed as women trying to pass as women. But these were like clearly masculine looking women, like clearly masculine. So what were people even mad about? I saw these viral
actually
clips.
The answer is if a predatory male wanted access to the female changing rooms or the female facilities, a brown house coat, a mop and a bucket was likely to be a much more effective disguise and rather easier to adopt than anything else. So, they were a bit, the trouble with the bathroom stuff is always the test and enforcement and how that's going to work. And my example with that as well, I use a mobile phone example. I say, look, we all have mobile phones. Criminals have mobile phones. Criminals find mobile phones tremendously useful in coordinating crime. But what we don't do is take mobile phones away from everybody. What we do is criminalize crime. And there are certain circumstances when criminals end up with orders that they may not have a computer or a mobile phone. And that's because they've committed a crime. We don't restrict everyone else's freedom in society because of a small number of wrongdoers.
I think that's a really strong argument. I guess one of the issues that you see online definitely is this fear among women of this idea that a portion of trans people gain sexual arousal from the thought of themselves as women. In fact, on one of your clips on YouTube, if you look underneath, like one of the top comments is like, we're supposed to be okay with a man in the ladies' room because he likes wearing women's panties while he's there. And so and it's just everywhere.
Welcome back to Listen to Trans People, where that's all we do. I would do anything to be her when masturbating.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.